First, let me give you some facts. Some of you may know that. Most people are not quite aware of the magnitude of fossil energy business in the world. Without going through details, if you add oil and natural gas, we are talking that something on the order of $5 to $10 trillion a year worldwide. That far exceeds anything that the world spends on military expenditures and so on. It's the biggest business on earth. And one of the problems in Israel is that as far as fossil energy is concerned, there's almost no, there's no real, there are very few people who are knowledgeable about it, deals with it, and so on. And now with the discovery of fairly large offshore deposits, we suddenly face a situation where we don't have the technical manpower to really think and develop and think about how to develop this resource in a modern way. Now, it turns out that in the last 20 years or so, it has become apparent that energy is emerging as a much bigger issue than we were used to in the 20th century. And this is a quote out of a paper by Richard Smalley, who I believe actually visited the Technion a few years ago and gave you a talk, as you told me last night. And this is a quote from him saying the most critical challenge in this century, 21st century, in his opinion, is energy. And I'll come back to that at the end. And why is that? Well, there are several fascinating facts that in general people don't comprehend the magnitude of this. 1 barrel of oil has the caloric value of something like, it's rough comparison, but something on the order of 10 men or women working 8 hours a day for 6 days a week for an entire year. So, for example, every American citizen is burning 25 barrels of oil per year. That's the consumption per capita in the United States. That's equivalent to 250 slaves, if you want. For the cost of 10 barrels today, it's $1,000, right? So the amount of work that we got used to extracting out of fossil energy is really amazing. In Israel, I think it's like something like 15 barrels per person per year, something like 14. So it would be equivalent to every one of you has 140 slaves working for you, and you don't have to feed them, you don't have to worry about their health and so on. And that's the real value of oil and natural gas. The second fact that is, you'll see in a minute, couples with it, is world population. This graph shows you world population since the year 0. So in the year 1000, when Jesus lived in Jerusalem, there were about 250 million people on earth. The first billion was reached in 1800. And since then, world population has exploded in a completely unprecedented way. We are in the midst of the incredible population explosion as we speak right here. And so, March 24th is what, just a few days ago. There's a website which updates world population every minute or every 2 minutes. You can look it up on the internet. So the population today is almost 7 billion people on Earth, and it's growing at the rate of about 72 million people every month are added to world population. That means that the population of France is added every month to the world. In 4 or 5 years, it's the population of the United States. So it's completely unprecedented, this explosive population. And it's a big question mark of how this is going to level off. The So we are in a population explosion that's completely unimaginable. So this combination of the extreme value in terms of work that we extract out of oil and natural gas, coupled with population explosion, is creating a real challenge to the world. Now, in terms of oil, this is just some data for some very large oil fields that have been discovered in the 20th century. And I showed you this slide simply to show you that these mega oil fields have, tend to have a sort of simple life history. They're discovered, they go into production fairly fast, and then they decline because they're finite in size and there's only so much pore space and so much oil in them. So this is a very general pattern that's been known from the beginning of the oil era, and it's still ongoing. And some of these are huge. For example, the Samotlor field in Russia, Soviet Union, peaked at production of 3 million barrels a day. That's more than most oil-producing countries today produce, except for Saudi Arabia and Russia and the United States. And then it went to decline. This usually takes 30 years or so. And then it produced very little. So in the late 50s, a well-known American geophysicist suggested, well, you know, this is the pattern. We understand it because these volumes are finite. If you add them all up, that's thanking Hubbert, this probably implies that the oil era is going to be finite in its time. Because you add up all these oil fields, and there are not an infinite number of them, and it's just the very big ones, you get a sort of a bell-shaped curve that will define the oil era in human history. So he came up with this cartoon, published first in 1956 in a report to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, where he said, well, we need to think about the oil and fossil energy era as a blip in history. And it started around maybe 1860 or 1870. And the question is, how long will it last? How much oil and gas are we going to be able to extract? That's the area under the curve. And when will it peak? And each one of these questions has some really serious implications, especially the peak, the point at which panic might set in. We got used to having so much oil, and suddenly we're going to begin to see a decline. What are we going to do? And so the mission he took upon himself in the report was to estimate the width of this pulse, the height of this pulse, the area under the curve, and when will this peak occur. And it's obvious that this is idealized shape. It doesn't have to be exactly a bell-shaped curve, but as a first approximation, it makes sense to me. And in fact, to try to estimate these parameters, he used the logistic equation, well known in population biology and population studies, which is basically like a bell-shaped curve. Something like this, that you have the quantity, in this case it's oil. This is the beginning of the oil era. First oil is discovered. And then when we discovered it, we began to find all kinds of exciting uses for it. And that led to more discovery. And so early in the oil era, you have exponentially growing discovery rate of oil. It takes about a decade or so, historically, to recover that oil. So you have a second curve that is the growth of oil recovery. Now, if the oil worldwide or region-wise or nation-wise is finite, then at some point it will begin to level off and there will be no more discoveries and no more recovery. The difference between these two curves is proven reserves and given time. And this is the famous Hubbert peak. At this point, as you will see here in a minute, So this is the proven reserve at any given time. That's the peak of proven reserves, after which the reserves decline. And this is the derivative of the previous slide. It shows the rate of change of discovery, production, and reserve as a function of time. So what this highlights is that, according to his thinking, there will be a time when production rate will cross discovery rate, and from here on, our reserve rate is becoming limited. And at some point, it's the end of the oil or fossil energy era. Well, he published the first attempt at this in 1956. And he was ridiculed, just like often happens for good, straightforward thinkers. What he did, he looked at the production history of the lower 48 states in the United States since the beginning, late in the 19th century. He had pretty good data through the year 1954. And what he did, he fitted this logistic curve, which has only 3 parameters. He used this to fit it and make some prediction about the future. Now, at the time, when you look at the literature, the U.S. Geological Survey, the oil companies, and so on, the literature is filled with debates of whether the slope of increasing production in the United States will it continue that steeply or will it be less steep and so on. Then King Hubbert came in and said, guys, you're all wrong. It's irrelevant what you're doing. This is what's going to happen. And in fact, he predicted that this exponential growth through 1954 will level off around 1970. In fact, in his report, he said 1971, at the level of about 3 billion barrels a year for the United States, and then it would decline. This is a comparison between his curve, predicted curve, and each one of these black lines is the actual production of oil in the lower 48 states in the United States through the year 19-something. It's a very remarkable result because it's very rare in earth sciences that we make any real good prediction of anything. People say, well, he was lucky, or it was an accident that he predicted it right. But he really, the emphasis of his exercise was not that. It was just that there will be a decline, but there will not be a decline in consumption. And so this is a cartoon that shows you the decline in production in the United States as opposed to the increase in consumption of oil in the United States, both because of population increase, increased standard of living, and so on. So a gap began to develop, a deficit of production versus consumption, which should have caused real alarm for the United States, but it actually didn't. And the reason it didn't is because while the U.S. became a net oil importer, the rest of the world was awash with oil, especially in the Middle East. There was huge amounts of oil, very little markets. The price was very low. Lifting cost of the oil, a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia was 50 cents. So it really wasn't that big a deal. We go in the U.S., we said, well, we go to the rest of the world and we make up this gap. At the time, no one thought that this gap will be, somehow it wasn't clear that this gap is growing exponentially fast. And in fact, today the U.S. is importing about 2/3 of oil it uses, and in 10 years or so, it'll probably be around 80%. But it did lead to, and this is where we move from geology and geophysics, we begin to move into political, economic, and eventually military aspect. This gap, as it grew, it led to a definition of U.S. national oil security policy on oil for the U.S. And it says, and this is official, in this case it's a quote from Clinton's when he was president, but this goes back to Carter. Carter was actually the first one who formulated this. The United States will continue to have vital interest in ensuring access to foreign oil supplies. It was an absolute necessity. We must continue to be mindful of the need for regional stability and security in key producing areas to ensure our access to and the free flow of these resources. Regional stability, where exactly? Security, what kind? Producing areas, where? And what does it actually mean, have access and free flow? Well, before we go into that, let me show you that what Anthony Hubbert figured out for the United States using this very simple logistic equation, which is only three constants. If you want, it would be the area under the curve, the timing of the peak, and the height of the peak. Three parameters. And from early on, many economists said, you're nuts, because the oil business, even then, was the biggest business on earth. It's very complicated. It's required technology, and policies, and subsidies, and government interference. It's inconceivable that you can reduce such a complicated system to three parameters, which is basically driven from geology. Here is a prediction we made at Stanford for Norway, which was by the mid-90s had exponential growth of oil production. We used Anthony Hubbert's algebra, very simple, and predicted that assuming different values for the area under the curve, oil production in Norway should peak sometime between 1995 maybe and 2000. And that's a very interesting thing here, because it really matters relatively little what the area under the curve, or what is the ultimate amount of oil they're going to recover. Because the way we do this business, once we find it, we produce it as quickly as possible. The oil companies want to sell it as quickly as possible. In Israel, they would want to sell the gas to Greece or to Europe as fast as possible to recover the cost of finding it and developing it. So you have exponential growth, but because it's a finite resource, then the exponential growth will basically level off. If this is the area under the curve, it will level off here, and if you have, in this case, maybe I think it's about twice as much reserves, you just gain about 10 years or 15 years before it levels off. You burn more of it, but you do it fast. So the amount of fuel that you have in the ground has relatively, historically speaking, a very small effect on when the decline will begin. And this is a report from Norway that was published 2 years ago, and lo and behold, the peak of conventional production happened in the year, it should be about 2000, I believe. And what you see here above this blue line is what they hope they'll be able to come up with in the future. But that's kind of old. So Norway is an example. We just went through the peak, and they are beginning to worry about the consequences of this. Kuwait, which is the major oil producer in the world, the conventional oil production in Kuwait has been declining for the last 6 or 7 years. They hope that further development of existing oil fields will allow them to bump it up a little bit, but probably we are in this decade, this is going to decline. And the rest is more wishful at this point than reality. So in Kuwait, for example, they're beginning to worry about what will happen and this decline set in very fast. What will happen to Kuwait? Here's an example, very recent example from Egypt, which I think is extremely telling, to me at least. This is 1960 to 2000, and what is it? 20? 10? Anyway, this is, the green is oil production in Egypt, which started around late 60s. Egypt peaked in production about 500,000 barrels a day or 600,000 barrels a day. And it's been declining ever since. Egypt has just become a net oil importer. The gray you see is natural gas, which they have plenty of, but even that's peaked already and it's declining. The dark line, the brown line, is Egypt's consumption of oil. And it's maybe gratuitous, but at this point, the Egyptian government didn't have all that much money to subsidize things like food and fuel in Egypt. And you could make the case, or you could argue, that what's happening in Egypt today is at least in part related to the fact that suddenly the Egyptian government that used this income finds it very difficult to subsidize food. The price of food in Egypt has doubled in the last 2 years, and the price of fuel has increased a lot, and that has caused, in part, the difficulties for most Egyptians to even eat. This, meanwhile, is Egypt's population. Today it's about 80 million people, grew by 20% over a period of, 10 years. So on the one hand, the resource base, including the money that the exporting of oil provided to Egypt, has declined to the point that they don't have it anymore. At the same time, the population is exploding, and that is a source of tremendous internal tension. Hubbert at the time also looked at the world as a whole. In the same exercise, he had the production history of oil in the world, and then he fitted two curves, making assumptions about what the area under the curve, because you have to predict it to some extent. So the lowest curve is assuming that ultimately we'll recover 1.3 trillion barrels of oil. The broken line is 2.1 trillion, so it's 50% more. And then I added, using the same algebra, 4.1 trillion barrels of oil. This would include more or less all the heavy oil sands and that we have on Earth. And again, the same issue that the peak moves over to a later date, but not very much, because once we have access to this oil, we burn it. And if you find more, we burn it faster. So anyway, that's an estimate for the world. The big problem is that unlike the United States in 1971, the world doesn't have another world to go and import oil. So this is roughly what's projected for oil production in the future, and that's roughly what's projected for energy demand in the future. So right now we are probably somewhere in this region, so it's not a huge issue yet. But we don't have to wait for long, 20, 30 years, where we are going to have insurmountable deficit of energy obtained from oil. And natural gas is delayed by maybe 10 or 15 years, but it's going to be the same issue. Because the resource is finite in size. Now, so this is where the issue of peak oil and the future of oil has led to a sort of confrontation with the economists. This is a plot that shows per capita income per year. And this is per capita oil consumption in barrels per year. And if you want, this could be energy. You could change the scaling with the energy. And it's not surprising that there is a very straightforward correlation between income, or if you want standard of living, and the amount of energy available. In the United States, I told you each American has 25 slaves working for a cost of $1,000 a year. Canada, Japan, Europe, all up here. And then down here you have Mexico at about 6 barrels per person per year, Brazil about 5.5, China and India. It looks a bit innocent, but most of the world's population is actually down here. What economists tend to say, many economists tended to say, they still do, is that it's no big deal, you know, for these poor economies to rise. All they have to do is walk up the slope of the standard of living. Get more energy, develop yourself, develop industry, more food, more standard of living, and so on. But there's a problem because, remember, the resource is finite. The population is exploding. So is it going to collide or not? Are you going to be able to do it? So we wanted to bring world consumption per capita per year to 1/4 of U.S. consumption rate. We'll have to increase oil production or energy production by something like 35%. If everybody on Earth would use 1/3 the rate at which Americans burn oil, we'll have to increase oil production by almost double. And then it becomes a bit ridiculous because if everybody on Earth would burn as much oil as Canadians or Americans, you will have to add 440% more energy available per year. And it turns out that's impossible because the resource is finite. And that has led, as I said, to a real, it's more than a debate, it's a vicious debate between geologists and economists. Colin Campbell was an early promoter of the concept of peak oil or finite oil. He said depletion of oilfields of oil has built a chasm between the natural scientist who observes nature and applies its immutable physical laws and the flat earth economist who thinks that investment creates resources under the laws of supply and demand, says a geologist. Here is what typical economists say. The work of the Hubbert modelers has proven to be incorrect in theory and based heavily on assumptions that the available evidence shows to be wrong. They have repeatedly misinterpreted political and economic effects as reflecting geological constraints and misunderstood the causality underlying exploration, discovery, and production. This is really hot debate. The geologist says economists are clueless. They just believe in the law of supply and demand. They're idiots. And the economists say, you guys who explore and discover and produce oil, you don't know what you're doing. You don't understand. So it's a big gap. And this gap has some implications for government policies and so on, as you'll see in a few minutes. So the question is, what rules the oil business? Is it demand? It's the economists would believe in market forces, supply and demand. Or is it supply? Demand means that market forces take care of any or most problems. If there's a growing demand for oil or energy, well, you guys will, the markets and the engineers and the geologists will just find a way to meet it. That's a law of nature. It's like Newton's laws. This is another one. But if it's a resource availability, as we in our science tend to believe, it means that political panic at some point will set in when the resource becomes unavailable, or it's not equally available, or it's not available to all. This is a slide that shows a projection made by, in this case, it's by a Shell Oil company, but many companies have a similar thing. It says at present, this is our present one is the amount of energy we consume on Earth right now. And the estimate that is within 50 years or so, we'll probably need 2.5 times as much. And that's because population increase and standard of living increase. And so by the year 2060, 2060, it appears that, according to this projection, that oil will play about the same, it will provide about the same amount of barrels per year as it does today, roughly speaking. Between gas and oil will be about the same as it is today. Coal may grow a little bit. And the rest of the demand will have to come from other sources. So many people call these geothermal, solar, biomass, wind, and nuclear alternative energy sources. These are not alternatives. These are going to be additional. We don't have alternatives. We will, in 50 years from now, we still will need to use fossil energy resources at the same level as we are today, but they will constitute only a smaller fraction of the global need for energy. Now, when I show this slide, I know at Stanford, and economists see my talk, they say, well, what do you call it demand? Why don't you call it supply? And the problem is that as engineers and as scientists, it is not clear that we will be able to produce that much energy from these additional energy sources 50 years from now. We hope that we will, but we don't know at this point for sure, and we don't know what kind of financial investment will be needed to bring into that. And so billions of barrels per year discovered. Each red column is the amount of oil discovered every year since 1930. And discovery has peaked sometime around the mid-60s or 70s. It's been declining ever since. We find it more and more difficult to find the mega oil fields that supply most of those reserves. This black line is the rate of production, or if you want to produce it, we burn it right away. There's no storage really. So the crossover point, our Hubbert's peak, sometime in the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, as far as oil is concerned, we have been beginning to burn more oil per year than we are finding and producing. And this gap is growing. This is a projection for the future. Even if you leave it flat, this is growing at the rate of about 2% per year. 1% is population growth, and another 0.5% is standard of living growth in the Earth. So the gap between what we can hope to discover in the future and what we will need in oil is growing alarmingly. And the crossover, the peak was sometime in 1990 or maybe 2000. Another piece of evidence that we are in trouble in this sense is that many of the big oil companies have been unable to replenish their reserves. They produce oil and they're not able to find new oil to replenish their reserves. So instead they buy each other. This does not lead to the discovery of any new oil. Just for the shareholders, it's a good thing. So when Chevron bought Texaco, they could tell their shareholders, our reserves have been replenished. But it doesn't lead to the discovery of new oil. And that's a problem for the world. This list is growing every year because it is becoming more and more difficult to find enough oil to replenish what's produced. Now, world oil consumption is shown here. The world is consuming, now it's up to about 33 billion barrels a year. The U.S. about a quarter of it. China is relatively small right now, and India is very small. And per capita, the slide is a bit old, but it's about 5 barrels per person per year is world average. 25 barrels in the United States. China is about 2, India is about 1. These are the big consumers. Now, where are the producers? There's a geographic mismatch, which has been known for a long time, but it's coming to a head now, between the major oil producers, oil reserves, if you want, which are not the users. Saudi Arabia has about a quarter of oil proven reserves on Earth. Iraq has about 11%. The United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi mostly is 10%. Kuwait is 9%. Iran is 9%. Venezuela is 8%. And Russia and then Libya is about 3%. So the oil is in certain areas, and the consumer are in other areas. The oil is getting more difficult to find. So the U.S. foreign policy has played a role, and that is that we have to secure, the U.S. needs to secure safe and manageable resources of oil for this growing thirst for oil that is needed. And that has led to a bunch of skirmishes that have to do with the 6 or 7 major oil producers on Earth, oil reserves. The first one was the war in Kuwait, the Gulf War in 1991. Saddam Hussein figured that if he can take Kuwait over, he will double his reserves and become the second Saudi Arabia. And the U.S. and Western Europe decided that they cannot tolerate it, because aside from ideology, it's just against their national security policy with respect to energy. The second skirmish, I call it skirmish because, after all, these oil-producing countries have to sell their oil. It's valueless unless they sell it. So it's more like Shuk Machane Yehuda, a bargain. When the West has greater need of oil, then the oil-producing countries up the prices and up the terms and so on, and we have skirmishes. The second one is the 9/11 attack in the United States. And this, most people would say, well, what is it? Right? What does oil have to do with Bin Laden attacking the United States? The third one is the war in Iraq. The United States broke down in a really messy war in Iraq because Iraq is number 2 oil reserves on the earth. The 9/11 attack on the United States, according to people who have looked at this in detail, is actually pretty straightforward. Actually, when you ask yourself, why did Bin Laden attack the United States? What's the point? Well, it turns out that the royal family in Saudi Arabia, unlike just about any other country in the world, actually owns the oil of the country. It's not owned by the nation. It's owned by the royal family. It's about 4,000 princes. And what Bin Laden represents is a movement to get rid of the royal family and change the ownership of oil in Saudi Arabia, and also make sure that the revenues are distributed more equitably throughout the country. It turns out Saudi Aramco is selling oil for right now $900 million a day. They produce 9 million barrels of oil a day, so they bring in $900 million a day. It costs about $50 million a day to run Saudi Aramco as an oil company. It's all the expenses drilling and producing and shipping. And more Saudis ask themselves, where are those several $100 million going? They don't show up in the standard of living of Saudi Arabia. They're not really invested in the country. So this interpretation would be that Bin Laden represents a movement whose goal is to take the oil field. Now the royal family stays in power in Saudi Arabia because the U.S. has supported it militarily, economically, politically. And so the simplest interpretation is that the attack on the United States, the Twin Towers, Pentagon, and in the White House and Senate, is to alert the royal family that the days are counted. No, the days are limited. They should count the days to stay in power because their protector, the U.S., is vulnerable. And whether we like this interpretation or not, it probably is something that's going to happen. Because this is untenable. That a family of 4,000 princes will just own the largest single oil, maybe a quarter of all the oil. Then we have skirmish in Iraq. Several months before the attack of 9/11, the White House was already considering toppling Saddam and was studying Iraq oil fields. Dick Cheney was pivotal both in advancing the administration's plans for regime change in Iraq and the formulating of the U.S. energy policy. The map was studied in the spring of 2001 by Cheney of the White House and a select group of oil company executives meeting in secret. It shows Iraq Southwest neatly divided into 9 exploration blocks. This was months before the 9/11 attack on the United States. Dick Cheney, who is not particularly a sweet fellow, but he understood the implication of if Saudi Arabia, if the royal family in Saudi Arabia collapses, the U.S. has an immense problem in securing an oil province from which there would be a free flow. And he figured out that Iraq would be the ideal replacement. And the National Security Council directive dated February 2001, 7 months before the 9/11 attack, by my ex-provost at Stanford, Lisa Nice. She was the National Security Advisor to the President at the time. Instructed the staff to cooperate fully with the task force that would be considering the melding of 2 policy areas, the review of operational policies towards rogue states and actions regarding the capture of new and existing oil and gas fields. So the U.S., by necessity, according to Cheney, had to prepare for taking over Iraq. And they thought that Saddam was really a terrible dictator, and the Iraqis would love it to get rid of him, and the U.S. would come in and will democratize the country, and in the process also try to convince the Iraqis to privatize their oil business, and that would fit into U.S. National policy. And since then, we are messing with Iran, which is number 5, and Venezuela, which is number 6. And just a few weeks ago, now we're in Libya, which is number 8 oil reserves on the earth. So I think the pattern is pretty clear. The West and the U.S., they don't go to we don't go to Paraguay to get rid of dictators or to so on. But the oil overrides our commitment to democracy and development and so on. So why do I call it local skirmishes? Because these countries, Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Libya, they all have to sell their oil in order to make a living. There is no other income in those countries. Taxpayers. So somehow it's just a question, it's just skirmishes. We won't have a global war with them. But this whole issue takes on a completely new dimension when we consider not oil-producing countries, but other oil-consuming countries. And China is the most obvious one. This is the history of oil production in China and oil consumption. Until 1993, the Chinese government believed that they are going to be the next Saudi Arabia. Our universities are filled with experts on energy, experts on water, experts on food. There are a lot of experts on the environment now. There are experts on poverty. There are experts on war. But what we are missing, in my opinion, is structures, organizations that look at this as an integrated way. And so what we did in our course, I said, well, the first thing, these 10 things that he lists, they're all connected actually to energy. For example, water, desalination is an issue of energy. Plenty of water, desalination is energy. Food is fertilizers. Education, population, democracy, and so on. You don't have time to go into it. But it's not just that you have a list of issues, but they are interconnected. So these are connections of energy. And in fact, when you think about it, this is the real interconnection, where everything's connected to everything. And in my opinion, this could be sort of a concept or vision for some future research programs in academic institutions. We need to find a way to get experts in these different, or expertise in these different disciplines to look at maybe, influence functions. I'll stop there.